in the quiet suburbs of Cedar Pines. The Dawson family lived a life that was, by all outward appearances, the ideal embodiment of middle-class American life. James and Tina Dawson, the proud parents of two daughters, were known throughout the community as upstanding citizens. To their neighbors, they were the epitome of virtue, raising their twin daughters, Lena and Laura, in a household that emphasized values, discipline, and an unwavering dedication to religious faith. Lena and Laura Dawson were a striking pair. With their matching jet black hair and piercing green eyes, they seemed almost like mirror images of each other as children. They were inseparable, moving through life as if bound by an invisible thread that only they could feel. They had their own secret language, often finishing each other's sentences and knowing each other's thoughts before a word was even spoken. They were a perfect picture of twin closeness, admired by some and envied by others. As they grew older, Lena and Laura began to notice something deeper about their bond. What they felt for each other went beyond the conventional boundaries of sisterhood. In whispered conversations late at night, when the rest of the house lay silent, they confessed to each other feelings that neither could fully comprehend. It started with subtle glances and lingering touches, moments that made their hearts race and left them with a sense of exhilaration and guilt that they couldn't escape. They both understood, almost instinctively, that this was something they could never reveal to the world around them, least of all to their parents. James Dawson was a man of strict principles. As a retired military officer, he had brought up his daughters with a stern hand, believing that discipline and order were the cornerstones of a respectable life. Religion was central to his world, and he attended church every Sunday without fail, often dragging the girls along, even when they were visibly uninterested. To James, any deviation from his moral compass was a weakness, an imperfection that needed to be corrected. He held an unshakable belief that a normal life meant marrying, settling down, and raising a family, values he was determined to see his daughters uphold. Tina Dawson, meanwhile, was equally traditional, though her strictness came from a place of deep-seated fear. Having grown up in a conservative household herself, Tina had internalized a rigid view of the world, one where deviation from societal norms was not just frowned upon but condemned. She was a woman who valued appearances, always worried about what people would think if her daughters strayed from the path she had envisioned for them. The twins, feeling suffocated, learned to adapt. They pretended to be interested in the boys that their mother would try to set them up with, and even played along with her dreams of future weddings and grandchildren. But they knew, deep down, that those fantasies belonged to a world they couldn't inhabit. They harbored a secret that could never see the light of day, for it would shatter everything their parents believed in, and expose them to ridicule and hatred in a society that wouldn't understand. As they reached adulthood, Lena and Laura's bond grew even stronger, evolving into a profound, complex relationship that transcended mere affection. But living under the watchful eyes of their parents meant that they had to hide it, restrain it, and confine it to the shadows of their private world. Their mother's constant nagging about dating and marriage became a source of dread. Each suggestion of a nice young man felt like a noose tightening around their shared secret. They were not only hiding their feelings from the world, but also from themselves, trapped between their love for each other and the crushing weight of societal expectations. The pressure built over the years, with their parents' expectations growing more insistent. Tina began to sense that something was amiss. That her daughter's lack of interest in boys and relationships was unnatural. She attributed it to a lack of guidance, to phase they would outgrow with the right influence. But when Lena and Laura continued to avoid the subject of dating, her suspicions turned to disappointment and frustration. To her, they were ungrateful for the opportunities they had been given, for the stable, morally upright home in which they were raised. Tina confided in her husband and James with his military precision. Resolved that something had to be done, he decided that they would confront the girls, talk sense into them, and if necessary, seek outside help. For them, their daughter's unusual closeness was no longer a sign of sibling affection, but a deviation that needed to be corrected. They began to feel that something was fundamentally wrong with their daughters, a flaw that could tarnish their family's name. If exposed, it was a late evening in December when the Dawson family sat down for what began as an ordinary family dinner, but quickly escalated into a confrontation that would forever change the course of their lives. The tension in the air was palpable as James and Tina, under the guise of casual conversation, began probing their daughters about their future plans, their lack of interest in finding a husband, and their strange behavior that others had started to notice. Cut off guard, Lena and Laura exchanged nervous glances. They had always feared this moment, knowing that there would come a time when they could no longer keep their secret buried. But they weren't prepared for the hostility that came next. James, unable to contain his frustration, accused them of being selfish and ungrateful, of rejecting everything he had worked so hard to instill in them. Tina, her voice trembling with anger, told them that they were an embarrassment to the family, a disappointment that had grown too large to ignore. She reminded them of the moral teachings they were raised with, of the importance of family and honor, when they could no longer keep up the charade. Lena and Laura confessed. They told their parents about the bond they shared, hoping that even if they didn't understand, they might show some compassion. Instead, their parents reacted with outrage and disgust. Tina, shaking with anger, accused them of committing a sin, calling them an abomination in the eyes of God. And James, equally enraged, declared that they would see a psychiatrist first thing in the morning. He warned them that if they didn't change, he would expose their secret to the world, telling anyone who would listen about their sickness and their sin. The words cut deeper than any wound. To Lena and Laura, this wasn't just a reprimand, but a betrayal, a complete rejection of who they were at the core. They had always known their parents wouldn't understand, but they hadn't anticipated the level of hatred and rejection they were now facing. That night, as they lay in their shared room, Lena and Laura felt a storm of emotions: hurt, anger, humiliation, and a growing sense of despair. They were cornered, with no path forward that didn't lead to suffering and shame. Their parents, the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally, had turned against them, threatening to reveal their secret and subject them to a lifetime of ridicule and scorn. As the hours ticked by, the seeds of resentment began to take root. For the first time, they entertained a thought they had never dared to consider: a way to end their suffering and free themselves from the people who sought to destroy them. In the darkness, with only each other for comfort, they began to plan. It was a plan born of desperation, one that would forever alter their lives, leading them down a path from which there would be no return. The hours crept by as the twins lay in their bedroom, restless and haunted by the echoes of their parents' angry words. It was a cold December night, but Lena and Laura felt nothing of the winter chill. All they felt was the tightening grip of fear and rage, a storm that simmered, its intensity only fueled by the silence that had fallen over the Dawson household. In the bleak darkness, they whispered to one another, plotting a future without the burden of their parents' condemnation. a life where they could finally be free to live without hiding. Their whispered words held the seeds of something both terrifying and strangely liberating. The idea of ending the oppression at its source. Lena was the first to voice it, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "We can't live like this, Laura," she murmured, her voice tinged with desperation. "If they're not here, no one else will know." Laura looked at her sister, her heartbeat pounding in her chest. She felt a flicker of fear, but it was quickly replaced by a strange sense of calm as the thought took root. In that moment, the bond between them grew unbreakable, fueled by a shared pain and anger that only they could understand. There, in the quiet of their room, the plan crystallized. It was a plan that required courage, precision, and a complete severing of any attachment to the life they'd known. Over the next day, Lena and Laura moved through the house with a careful calmness, and concealing their plan beneath a mask of obedience. Their parents were watching them closely, expecting defiance or signs of rebellion, but the twins were deliberate in their compliance. They attended dinner without protest, listened in silence as James and Tina reiterated their plans to send them to therapy and correct them. But beneath this calm exterior, Lena and Laura were preparing. They'd spent the morning studying the house in detail, identifying areas they could use to their advantage. They knew the family's routines well. The times their father locked up, the way their mother checked the doors before going to bed, the exact order in which they prepared to sleep. They memorized it all, preparing to use that knowledge to carry out their plan. That evening, as their parents slept soundly, Lena and Laura went over the plan one last time. They would have to be meticulous. Any slip could mean failure, and any hesitation could cost them their freedom. They took a moment to steady themselves, looking into each other's eyes with a shared understanding. This was their only way out, a grim but final path toward freedom. Around midnight, Lena and Laura moved silently through the darkened house. They had chosen this time deliberately, knowing their parents would be deeply asleep and unaware. Lena led the way, her movements calculated, as she held a small flashlight to guide them through the hall. Laura followed closely, clutching a heavy wrench she had taken from the garage earlier in the day, her grip firm as she steeled herself for what was to come. They approached their parents' bedroom, where James and Tina lay oblivious to the danger lurking just outside their door. Lena, calm but tense, pushed open the door carefully. Just enough to see their parents sleeping soundly, she nodded to Laura, signaling that it was time. Laura's heart raced as she raised the wrench, focusing on her mother's figure in the bed. She knew there could be no hesitation. No moment of doubt. In a swift, decisive motion, she brought the wrench down. Aiming for her mother's head, Tina stirred only briefly. Before the blow rendered her unconscious, and Laura repeated the action, her face expressionless as she delivered each blow with a cold detachment. Meanwhile, Lena had taken a position beside her father's side of the bed. James began to stir, startled by the noise, but Lena moved quickly, covering his mouth with one hand and pressing a pillow over his face with the other. James fought against her, his eyes wide with shock. But his strength quickly waned as he struggled to breathe. Laura, seeing her sister struggle, moved to help. Adding her weight to the pillow until James lay still, the life gone from his eyes. In those few minutes, the Dawson household had fallen into an unnatural silence, broken only by the quiet, labored breathing of the two sisters. They stood beside the bed, taking in the reality of what they had done. It was both liberating and horrifying. A surreal feeling of power and fear that left them trembling. Their hands shook as they gathered their belongings, packing a few essential items and taking what money they could find. They had planned their escape down to the last detail, knowing they would need to be swift and careful to avoid suspicion. They took only what they needed, moving quietly through the house and locking the front door behind them. As they slipped out into the night, outside, the air was crisp and cold, biting at their skin as they made their way down the street. They kept to the shadows, moving with purpose as they headed toward the bus station at the edge of town. There, They would board a bus to a nearby city, far enough away to avoid recognition, but close enough that they could travel on foot without attracting attention. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. They boarded the bus, keeping their faces turned away from any prying eyes, and settled into their seats, their minds racing with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They were free, unbound from the life that had suffocated them for so long, liberated from the expectations and condemnation that had once defined their existence. But freedom, they would soon learn, was fleeting. The bodies of James and Tina Dawson were discovered the following morning by a neighbor who had come to check on them. The sight that greeted her was one of horror. The lifeless bodies of two beloved members of the community, slain in their own bed. The news spread quickly, shocking the town and sending ripples of fear through the community. The police were called, and an investigation was launched, with detectives combing through the Dawson home for any clues that might reveal the identity of the killers. As the investigation unfolded, it didn't take long for suspicion to fall upon Lena and Laura. The twins had vanished without a trace, leaving behind no indication of their whereabouts or their plans. The detectives interviewed friends, neighbors, and relatives, piecing together a picture of the Dawson family dynamics and the tension that had simmered beneath the surface for years. The family's strict values, the twins' reluctance to date, and the argument that had taken place just days before the murder, all pointed to a potential motive. The detectives also discovered a series of hidden journals in the girls' room, private writings in which they had documented their feelings for one another, their struggles with their identity, and their fear of their parents' disapproval. The journals painted a tragic picture of two young women trapped in a world that refused to accept them, forced to hide their true selves out of fear and shame. The revelation of the sisters' relationship shocked the community, further fueling speculation and condemnation. To many, the murders were an act of pure evil, a calculated betrayal of family trust. But to others, the journals told a different story. A story of two young women pushed to the brink by a society that had left them no other choice. The twins' freedom came to an abrupt end 2 days later, when they were apprehended at a small motel on the outskirts of the city. They had been living in hiding, moving from place to place. But a tip from a motel worker who recognized them led the police directly to their location, and the police arrived. Lena and Laura were taken into custody without resistance. They sat in the interrogation room side by side, their expressions unreadable as they faced the detectives who questioned them. They refused to speak, offering no explanation for their actions, no justification for the lives they had taken. But the evidence was overwhelming. The journals, the accounts of neighbors who had witnessed the tension in the Dawson household, and the fingerprints left at the scene, all pointed to their guilt. In court, they showed little emotion, their faces blank as the prosecution detailed the gruesome events of that December night. They listened in silence as the judge pronounced their sentence, knowing that they would never again see the freedom they had longed for. The story of Lena and Laura Dawson became a haunting reminder of the consequences of secrecy, repression, and the devastating toll that societal expectations can exact on those who dare to defy them. Some viewed the twins as monsters, cold-blooded killers who had betrayed the very people who had raised them. Others saw them as tragic figures, victims of a world that had refused to accept them for who they were. In the years that followed, the Dawson murders would become a cautionary tale, a story retold in hushed whispers by those who had once known the family. The house where the murders took place stood empty, a silent reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls, its once pristine rooms now tainted by the memory of bloodshed and betrayal. And as for Lena and Laura, they spent their days in separate prison cells, their lives forever bound by the dark secret they had once shared. Their bond, once a source of strength and comfort, had become a prison of its own, chaining them to a memory they could never escape, a past they could never forget.